So what are some narratives around processes and people that are currently out there? Well, so there's a lot of discussion about how we need regulation and we need processes to save the environment. So the European Union Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative comes down very heavily on the idea that we need legislation and regulation. And one reason is because they say there's a problem with the people. So in particular, they say that directors cannot be relied on to sort of manage corporations effectively because they are not stakeholder-oriented enough. So the problem is, in their view, that directors, one of the key problems is that directors favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value. In fact, the European Union is quite strong on this. They said that problem driver number one in the sustainable governance problem is directors' failure to consider stakeholders because they care too much about shareholders. Another narrative that's related to people, so there's the process part, but there's also like a more direct, so directors in general are bad, but maybe some directors could be okay. In particular, if we appoint more women to boards, then the idea is that we'll have more sort of CSR, more sustainability-oriented strategies, because more women leaders, let me make sure I get this right, means higher levels of corporate social responsibility, right? So maybe all we need to do is, so directors in general bad, but women as directors good, because they care more about the environment than men, okay? And then, of course, the next part of the people part is we need to involve the next generation, right? Okay, so I'm gonna take an evidence-based approach to some of these narratives. And I'm drawing here on data, measures, and ideas from a couple of papers. I'm not going to talk specifically about the papers. I'd just like to point out the last paper. The title is supposed to be, there's a typo. The title is supposed to be, What's Good for Women is Good for Science. And the title is here, What's Good for Women is God for Science. And I've decided actually that's a better title. So if you ever look up the paper, please think of it as What's Good for Women is God for Science, instead of the actual title. In fact, I've thought about writing to the journal and asking them to change it, just to make it official. But all right, so I'm going to show you some data. The data, I have two variables of interest, or two main variables of interest. One is a variable called universalism. I have data on universalism. What is universalism? It's a Schwartz human value. I'll talk a bit about what human values are in a second, how I'm measuring them. But essentially, what it's trying to capture, the definition from Schwartz, is understanding, appreciation, tolerance, and protection for the welfare of all people and for nature. If you're a universalist, you're broad-minded, you care about wisdom, social justice, equality, a world of peace, a world of beauty, unity with nature, protecting the environment. Okay, so very lengthy definition. Hopefully we can all agree that if you're interested in sustainability, this might be something we might be interested in as a concept, individual level characteristic. Now I actually have data on how universalist individuals are. I have data for the general population on universalism. This comes from the 6th wave of the World Values Survey, which is a representative survey of individuals around the world on their human values. So one of the human values is universalism. I've surveyed directors on their values, so I have data for directors on universalism. I've surveyed Oxford MBA students on their universalism. I've also surveyed finance academics on their universalism. So Aline mentioned that we set up the Women's Committee for the American Finance Association, and one of the things that we did is we surveyed academics, and then I sneakily, so the finance academics, so the members of the AFA, and I sneakily put in the values survey into that survey, so I have data that I'll show you in a little bit. Okay, the other measure that I think is relevant to this discussion about sustainability, in particular in the context of the European Union Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative, is a measure, is a variable called shareholderism. And so the definition of shareholderism is how much a person acting as a director favors shareholders over other stakeholders, such as employees, the community, and creditors. Now, I have data on shareholderism for directors through a survey, and I also surveyed, I gave the same survey I gave the directors to my Oxford MBA students. Thanks. Okay, so just briefly, I won't go into a lot of background on the measures, but let me just briefly talk about the Schwartz values. So Schwartz is a psychologist. He's done a lot of work on human values, also on country-level culture. And so what are human values? What are personal values? They're conceptions of the desirable. They constitute trans-situational criteria or goals, and people argue that they're driving forces for behavior. Now, in the Schwartz value framework, there's 10 human values. They're usually represented in this circular manner. So basically, the key axes are self-transcendence versus self-enhancement, and conservation versus openness to change. I'm going to primarily talk about universalism today, which is the measure I mentioned before. And we can think about universalism as essentially being a measure of how other regarding you are with respect to society. Okay. I will also talk a little bit about power. Power is power. Okay. Now, what is shareholderism? So this is a measure that I developed in conjunction with my co-author, Amir Licht, who's a corporate law scholar. And so basically what we said, there's a lot of discussion about corporate purpose and shareholders and stakeholders. And what we said, well, this idea of should you care about stakeholders versus should you care about shareholders only really matters when there's a direct conflict between the two parties. Now, a lot of corporate decisions, if you say, well, something's good for the employees, that makes them more productive, they're happier, will also shareholders benefit, right? So a lot of strategies actually benefit both parties. So discussing in whose interests the corporation should be governed only really matters when there's a direct conflict between the two parties. Now, how do we decide when there's a direct conflict between the two parties? If you know, let me know, right? But basically we said, well, we don't know. So we're letting the shareholders and stakeholders self-reveal when there's a conflict. How do they do that? They go to the courts. Okay, so what we did is we went to seminal court cases that involve shareholders on one side and stakeholders on the other side. And we used the court cases to develop vignettes of situations of conflict between shareholders and stakeholders. And then we asked directors, well, in these situations, if you're in the situation of conflict, how would you have decided? And this is what we then use in order to develop a measure of how shareholder or stakeholder directors are. And so the four cases that we have is we have Ford versus Dodge, which is about consumers versus shareholders. We have Park versus Daily News, which is about employees and shareholders. Then we have a creditor and shareholder case. And then the Schlensky versus Wrigley case is about the community and shareholders. Okay, so I have this measure. Well, I have a bunch of data. So I have shareholderism and I have universalism. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, are the current save the world narratives, which is that we need more regulation because directors are bad, we need more women in charge because they care more about the environment, and the next generation will do better. Are these narratives, are they justified? Okay. So what I did is I put universalism. So I have universalism in the general population. I have Oxford MBA student universalism. I have director universalism. So I put all this data together, and I ran a very simple regression, which is universalism as a dependent variable on a director dummy, a female dummy, and student dummy. Okay. Now what do you see? The coefficient on directors is negative. On females, it's positive, and on students, it's positive. So basically, it turns out directors are less other regarding, as measured by universalism, than the general member of the population. Okay, which may be interesting if we think about leadership, right? Women are more other regarding. exactly as people say, right? And the next generation, so Oxford MBA students are more regarding, right? So you look at this and you say, well, you know, Renee's only, 5 minutes into her talk, all the narratives are right, maybe there's more coffee, we can all go home, right? Or have coffee. Everything seems to be okay, right? All the narratives, okay. Well, obviously I'm here for a reason, right? Which is to say that I think we should dig harder. But this just illustrates that, you know, it looks like the narratives are right. Okay, so why are there reasons to dig deeper? Well, I'm a governance scholar, and you know, it's sort of surprising to me nowadays. So to date, basically the game in the literature has been to show that directors do not maximize shareholder value. I mean, you take any governance paper published in the last, you know, 20, 30 years, they'll say, oh, directors rubber stamp CEOs, they're entrenched, they're corrupt, I mean, you name it, right? So they're not maximizing shareholder value. But now the narrative has shifted. Now they're maximizing shareholder value too much. That's what people are arguing. They care too much about shareholders. So like, I can't get my head around this, right? So I'm like, whoa, like what the heck is going on? So which is it? They're too shareholder oriented or they're not shareholder oriented enough, right? Also, you know, I guess one could be slightly skeptical about whether processes work, right? So what's the evidence that regulation is going to fix all the problems? Maybe we could be skeptical, right? And also, as Aline mentioned, so I play in the gender space. I've been studying gender for a long time. And as someone, well, as both someone who studies gender and as a woman and as basically just a normal person, I struggle with generalizations. So I think that personal characteristics such as gender may not be sufficient statistics for preferences and attitudes. So when people say, oh, well, let's put the women in charge because they have this characteristic, that always makes me a bit uncomfortable because why it's like stereotyping, right? Which stereotyping, not so good necessarily. And also, you know, this whole argument about directors being so bad, you know, like we need to regulate because directors can't do their jobs. I'm always like, well, why do these inefficient managerial labor markets persist where they put the bad directors in charge? I mean, what the heck is going on? Like, what is the problem that we haven't been able to solve? So anyhow, so I think there's reasons to dig deeper. So let's dig deeper. Okay, so I'm going to use my data, and I'm going to look at a couple of questions. So the first question is it true that directors favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value over stakeholder interests? This is what the European Union argues must be right, right? European Union. Is it true that we need laws to force directors to do the right thing? Is it true that the next generation will do better? And is it true that having more women on boards will lead to better protection of stakeholders? Okay, so the first question, so do directors favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value over stakeholder interests? Well, I actually have data on director shareholderism. So we can look at the data and say, well, what does the data say? So I'm going to do something super simple. I'm just going to show you the histogram. So this is a histogram of director shareholderism. It comes from a survey of 1,010 directors in 23 countries. The data is from 2011. And if you're basically, as a director, if you have shareholderism at 6, you answered all the questions in our survey pro-shareholder. If you're at 1, you always answered pro-stakeholder. And you see most of the mass is in the middle. The mean is 3.4, right? So I look at this and I say, are directors too pro-shareholder? And I don't know, I'm a bit skeptical, right? So what does being too pro-shareholder mean? Not so obvious, right? And also I should say, it's not like we told them what we were doing, right? So it's not like we said, oh, we want to figure out if you care too much about shareholders, right? So just so if you're sitting there saying, oh, but maybe the directors were just trying to game the survey, we worked very hard to prevent that from happening. Okay. Now, what about this question, well, maybe we just need to regulate. So already I'm sort of like, well, the The European Union argument about, well, directors are too pro-shareholder, I'm like a bit skeptical, but like maybe laws would help move them in the right direction, because maybe they're still too pro-shareholder even though they're right smack in the middle. Like maybe we think they should be over here, right? So maybe if we enact laws, that'll push them over here. So we look at the law in our research. And in particular, we look at the role of common law. So common law is supposed to be the most shareholder-oriented law. Very simple, here's the full sample histogram, and then I broke out the common law countries, US and UK. There should be a 6 on this axis, so it is sort of smack in the middle, like the other ones. And you see the density is basically, again, most of the mass is in the middle for the US and the UK, just like for the full sample. And obviously, we do like millions of analyses to try to look at the role of the law in our work. And basically, the law has no predictive power for directors' attitudes. So then, again, I'm a bit skeptical. I'm like, well, actually, is it so clear that the law can change how directors think? Okay, now what about the next generation? So, you could say, well, maybe, these directors are still too pro-shareholder, and maybe the next generation will be more like, what's a good benchmark for current directors? Well, maybe the next generation, because obviously they're going to save the world, they might be a good benchmark. So I have this data from my Oxford MBA students. You probably don't know anything about the Oxford MBA program, but basically people go to Oxford because they want to do corporate purpose. So they go there for social justice reasons. So the MBA students at Oxford, when you ask them what do they want to do, none of them says we want to go work in investment banks. Well, some of them do, but probably the minority, which always makes our dean really upset because that means our rankings go down, right? Because if you don't go and work for an investment bank, you don't have high salaries upon graduating, and then your FT ranking goes down. So those, for people who work in business schools, you know what I'm talking about. Economists are probably like, what the heck? But basically, investment banking increases rankings, social purpose decreases rankings, and we're very good on social purpose. Okay, so the students go to Oxford because they want to save the world, right? Okay, so I gave the students the same survey. I asked the students, so how do you think you compare to the directors? And they're all like, oh, we're much more stakeholder-oriented. We don't care about shareholders, right? Because then we would go into investment banking. We care about stakeholders. So here's a histogram for the Oxford MBA students on shareholderism. You see the mean is 3.28. Most of the mass, again, is in the middle. Just to make the point, in the top here, I have the director data. In the bottom here, I have the Oxford MBA student data. There's no statistical or economic difference between the directors and the Oxford MBA students. So then I asked the students, so I showed the students the data, right? And then I said, well, what about, do you think that you guys are becoming more stakeholder-oriented over time, right? So this was data over a couple of years, so you could say, well, maybe the early classes were much more pro-shareholder, but the later classes are much more pro-stakeholder. And they're always like, yeah, we're much more pro-stakeholder now. So here's the trend. This is average shareholderism for each cohort. Here I have the representation of women in the cohort. Oxford is a very, social purpose. They care a lot about diversity in the MBA class, so they try to get lots of women. They don't care so much about diversity in the faculty, but that's another discussion we can have, right? But you see that, on average, there's no trend over time, right? So it's not like here they were pro-shareholder, and then here they're pro-stakeholder. It's basically the same. Okay, so what are some observations? So I should point out that the director data that I showed you is from 2011, which I would argue is a time period when people were not really talking so much about sustainability. And yet, in that data, most directors are in the middle, right? They're not super pro-shareholder, not super pro-stakeholder, right? Most of the mass is in the middle. So I would sort of say, well, that makes me, again, more skeptical that the European Union argument that they're too pro-shareholder actually holds. Also, as I mentioned before, the Oxford MBA students are supposed to be sustainability oriented, but they look exactly like the current directors, right? So they're not that different from current directors, which of course raises questions about how we think about the next generation versus the current generation. One thing that I want to get back to later is, I'm talking about averages here, but you saw there was a lot of variation in the data, right? So people don't all hold the same opinion. Most of the mass is in the middle, but there is a lot of variation in attitudes. Okay, so that's some observations. Now what about the gender issue, right? So is it true that more women leaders means higher levels of corporate social responsibility? And what is the argument behind this statement? This argument is that caring about stakeholders is caring about others, right? It's caring about the community, environment, caring about others. And as we know, women are more other regarding than men, right? Any men want to jump up and, no men want to take a stand for men? Okay. Okay. No men wanting to take a stand for men, so therefore the, must be true. So here what I have is the gender gap in shareholderism. Here's 0. This is just the average gender gap, the average shareholderism for women minus the average shareholderism for men. This is 0, the bar is to the right. What does that mean? It means female directors. Sorry, I forgot to mention this is the director data. Female directors are more pro-shareholder than the male directors. Okay, so the men are more pro-stakeholder. The women are more pro-shareholder. Okay. Okay, so basically what I did is I said, well, the common narratives seem right? But now I showed you some data where that hopefully raises some questions. So when confronted with situations that pit shareholders against stakeholders, directors do not look as pro-shareholder as one might think. The next generation looks remarkably like the current generation, and female directors are more pro-shareholder, not pro-stakeholder. So all the evidence I showed basically questions the standard narrative. Okay, so what the heck is going on? Right? How can it be? So I showed the narrative seem right, but now I showed you some more data. No, the narrative seem wrong. Right? So what's going on? So what I argue is that particularly, there's many reasons why these commonly accepted narratives may be wrong, but particularly when it comes to the people part of the narrative, there are a lot of problems. And particularly when we think about gender, so I'm going to focus on gender for the rest of this talk, there's a missing understanding of selection. Okay, and what do I mean by selection? It's the women who choose career paths that lead to a directorship. They're selected, right? But there's also the being chosen to be a director, right? So not every woman is chosen to be a director. And so does selection matter? I'm going to show you some evidence that suggests selection matters. Okay. Now, if you look at the data for the general population, right, so the argument about why women are if you have more female directors, you have more corporate social responsibility. The argument is based on this idea that women are generally more other regarding than men. Okay. Now, if you look at the data, I showed it to you earlier also, so let me just show it to you again. In the general population, it is true that as measured by universalism, women are more other regarding than men. Okay, so here is the general population, the world value survey. Here's average universalism for men, average universalism for women. In the general population, women are more other regarding as measured by universalism. This is also true among Oxford MBA students. So here are the men, here are the women. So also among Oxford MBA students. Now, what is the problem here? The problem is you can't generalize from the population to the boardroom. Maybe you can generalize to the Oxford MBA students, it's already a stretch, but then generalizing to the boardroom is really a stretch, okay? So let me show you why there's a problem with the generalization. So here what I've plotted is the gender gap, which is women minus men, in universalism in the general population. Okay, so it's positive. So in the general population, women are more other regarding than men. Now over here, what I've plotted is average universalism for female directors minus average universalism for women in the population. Okay, now here's 0. The bars to the left. It turns out female directors are less other regarding than the average woman on the street. Now, does that make sense? I would say probably, right? Because you don't get to be a director by thinking of other people, probably. Any directors here want to disagree? Yeah. Okay. Now, it turns out the same holds true for men. So here I've replicated the graph comparing female directors to women in the population. Here I'm comparing male directors to men in the population. So you see male directors are also less other regarding than the average man in the street. Okay. Now I'm going to put this together, and then I'm going to say, well, what's the gender gap in the boardroom? So here's the gender gap in the population. Here's comparisons between female directors and women in the population, male directors and men in the population. Here's a gender gap in the boardroom. And so it's women minus men. Here's 0. The bars to the left. In the boardroom, women are less other regarding than men. So the gender gap in the population flips when it gets to the boardroom, right? Okay, now why does it flip? Well, you look at the size of this bar versus the size of this bar. Female directors are much more atypical with respect to their other regardingness than male directors are with respect to their other regardingness as compared to the general population, right? So women are more atypical as directors than men. And therefore, the gender gap in the boardroom flips. Okay, it turns out that these differences are not statistically significant. These are statistically significant, but this one is not. So basically, in the boardroom, in the sample, the women and the men are the same in their other regardingness. Okay, but then, as I showed you earlier, women are more pro-shareholder. So if other regardingness is the only thing that matters for whether you're pro-shareholder or pro-stakeholder, as a lot of this discussion sort of assumes, why don't women and men have the same level of other regardingness? Well, it turns out that, people are not one-dimensional, and so there's more than one characteristic that matters for your attitudes towards shareholders and stakeholders. In particular, in one of the papers that I put up earlier, what I show with my co-authors is that if you're more other regarding, as measured by universalism, you are more pro-stakeholder. But if you're more power-oriented, achievement-oriented, or self-directed, you're more pro-shareholder. Okay, so now we can look at the selection effect for power. So here I'm doing the same thing as before. So in the general population, this is a gender gap for power orientation. It's women minus men. This is to the left of 0. So in the general population, women are less power-oriented than men. Okay. Now I compare the female directors to women in the population. Turns out that female directors are more power-oriented than the average woman on the street. And then I asked, well, does that make sense? And I would say, well, yeah, because directors, right, it's all about power, right? So it turns out that the female directors are very power-oriented. Male directors are also more power-oriented than the average man. Now you look at the size of this bar and the size of this bar, again, you see that female directors are more atypical as compared to their population counterparts than the male directors, right? So this bar is much bigger. So now what's the gender gap in the boardroom? So here's 0, women minus men. In the boardroom, female directors are more power-oriented than male directors. Okay, so again, the gender gap in the population flips in the boardroom. And power is important for shareholder orientation. So on universalism, women and men are the same in the boardroom. On power, they're different. The women are more power-oriented, and hence the women are more pro-shareholder in the boardroom. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, a lot of this discussion about women's trades is always very one-dimensional, right? So people talk about one characteristic at a time. We also typically only talk about averages. We never talk about distributions. So let me show you some distributions that make, some pictures of distributions that make similar points. So here I plotted distributions for the values that matter for your shareholder orientation. So here I have achievement, here I have power, here I have self-direction, and here I have universalism. Now, what are the distributions here? I have female directors, which is the blue line, and the dashed line is women in the population. Okay, so now you look at the distributions, and I would say, not totally clear where the averages are going, but female directors look a bit different than women in the population as characterized by their distributions. Maybe you disagree, but I look at this, I say, oh, they don't look exactly the same, right? Male directors, same. So here is the male directors. Here's the men in the population. Again, I look at the distributions, I say, not exactly the same, right? Now I look at female and male directors, the distributions for the same characteristics. I don't know, what about, do the female male directors look different? I see some no's, right? I mean, look at these graphs, now look at these graphs. I mean, tell me that the men and the women in the boardroom are different based on these pictures. I would say, well, actually they look pretty similar, right? They look pretty similar. There's a bit of a shift for power for the women. So here the blue line is the women, the dashed line is the red, doesn't matter, they both look the same, roughly, right? Okay, so in the boardroom, men and women look very similar. Yet still, here's a distribution for shareholderism. The women are still shifted to the right, right? So the women are still more pro-shareholder. Okay, so what's the point? The point is that selection matters, right? So people who end up in the boardroom are atypical. And of course, we can think about many reasons why the women might be more atypical than the men as compared to their population counterparts, right? And just to make the point with using my Oxford MBA student data, so I gave my MBA students the same shareholderism survey. Here's the male, here's shareholderism for the male students, here's shareholderism for the female students. So among Oxford MBA students, the women are more pro-stakeholder, so the smaller this is, the more pro-stakeholder you are. So among Oxford MBA students, it is true, the story is true. So the women are more pro-stakeholder. Now here are the directors. Among directors, the women are more pro-shareholder. Okay. Now, so what is the point? So my point is that assumptions matter, right? So we need to question the assumptions. The argument that people make concerning women in boards is that if you appoint more female leaders, that means higher levels of corporate social responsibility. And the data that I showed you suggests that, well, we need to think this through a bit more. It could be true, actually, if you appoint female Oxford MBA students, right? So I tell that to my students and they're all like really excited because they're like, yeah, because among MBA students, it is true that the women are more pro-stakeholder oriented. But among directors, the data that I showed you, it's the opposite, right? So the policy recommendation may actually have the opposite effect than the intended effect. And I should also make a point here about the current discussion about DEI and the meritocracy, right? So now there's a lot of discussion about, well, if you appoint women, so first people were like, oh, we need to appoint women because they're more corporate social responsible. And now people are saying, well, if we appoint women, then we're against the meritocracy, right? Now, in my data, so if you believe that maximizing shareholder value is the right thing to do, then actually you want to have more women on the board because they're more pro-shareholder, right? So it's not that you're against the meritocracy, it's actually you're against the meritocracy by not having the women. Okay, just wanted to make that point because, in case you've noticed, there's a lot of pushback against DEI. Okay, so So one reason that the women are, so I showed you a bunch of data suggesting that on values, women and men look pretty similar, but yet the women are still more pro-shareholder. So how does that happen? Well, we also need to think about other factors that may affect selection, which is in particular country and institutional level characteristics. So I have data on directors internationally. So what I've done here is I've plotted the gender differences in shareholderism by country. It's always women minus men, so it's averages. So in Australia, so here's 0. In Australia, female directors are more pro-shareholder than male directors. In Canada, the female directors are more pro-stakeholder. In India, no, that's Germany, sorry, I can't see so well. The women are more pro-shareholder. In India, they're more pro-stakeholder. In Ireland, they're more pro-stakeholder, et cetera, et cetera. So you see the point, it varies across country, right? So the differences vary across country. So why is that important? Well, it probably means that the selection mechanism varies across country. And just to do some back of the envelope illustration of this point, what I've done is I've divided the countries into high and low masculinity. There's a Hofstede measure of country level masculinity, which essentially means how tradition-oriented the country is. And here I've plotted shareholderism for directors in low masculinity countries and high masculinity countries by gender. And you see that in the low masculinity countries, the female-male directors look very similar. In the high masculinity countries, the female directors are more pro-shareholder. And so what's the point? If it's difficult for you to reach the director position, which is more likely to be the case in the high masculinity countries, the women exhibit more extreme positions relative to shareholders than to stakeholders. Okay, now the institutional environment affects selection. Selection can vary across countries. Selection can also vary over time. And so what are some points from this whole discussion? If we ask, do we have a good understanding of how directors and the next generation think? My answer would be no, not really. Do processes always work? No. Can we generalize from the population to the boardroom? No. Is being other regarding sufficient to favor stakeholders over shareholders? No. And can we generalize across institutional environments? And the answer would be no. So how do we save the world? Right, that was my promise to you that we would talk about how to save the world. I'm going to argue that I am talking about how to save the world because the whole point is that there are no easy answers. There are no easy answers. So processes may help, but presumably they need to be informed. Questioning assumptions is important, evidence is important, and most importantly, humility is important. We have to recognize that there's a lot of things that we don't know. Okay, now my evidence suggests that people can matter, so there's lots of interesting variation in the data regarding how people think about shareholders versus stakeholders, right? Yet beyond easy categories, so women, young people, current sustainable corporate governance discussions don't really talk about selection processes. How do we make sure that the people who we want to be in charge are in charge? Okay. And as a governance scholar, if anyone's doing governance here, I think this is a topic that's really important for research, and there's very little that's been done in this space. Okay, so now, is there any hope? Right. And I would say, yes, there is hope if we teach the next generation how to think. Okay, and I think this is really important for someone who works at a business school, or I guess for any academic. A lot of discussion about dumbing down of the curriculum, right? I think you need to resist, right? Because how is the next generation going to solve our problems if we don't actually teach critical thinking, right? And so some hope that I gained from my MBA students is I showed them this data. I asked them what their expectations were, and then I showed them that they look different than the way that they thought they would look. you know, all these people at Oxford, they're like, we're corporate social, we're going to save the world. And I said, well, actually, you look exactly like the directors. And that for them, they were like, oh my God, what the heck is going on, right? But afterwards, they came up to me and they said, look, this was the best lecture of the entire MBA. I always teach in the spring. It's a one-year program. So, you know, it's like, you know, not like a two-year program. So, you know, but still, best lecture of a one-year program MBA. And the reason is they said, you gave us a challenge, but we were forced to think and we learned a lot. And then they said, I wish more of our MBA classes were challenging. And to me, that gave me hope, because it showed to me that the students have the capacity for thinking. It's our job to deliver on the critical thinking. So now, of course, you know, we need to teach something to the students. We need to challenge them. So now I come to the finance academics. So can finance academics, and sorry, economists, I only have data for finance academics, so can we deliver? And so here I have data on finance academic values. So as I said, I snuck a survey on values into a survey to American Finance Association members. And what I have here is I'm comparing finance academics to the general population as measured by the World Value Survey. How am I doing on time? Okay, all right, okay. So I'll walk you through the...
15 minutes.
Okay, all right. I'll walk you through the all the data, not just the ones that are most relevant for my point, just because I think it's super interesting, because academics are interesting. Hopefully you guys agree, right? Okay, so here are the 10 human values as measured in the Schwartz system. So as compared to the general population, finance academics are more achievement-oriented than the general population. I think it makes sense. There are two measures of benevolence. So this may surprise some people, but finance academics are actually more benevolent than people in the general population. You know, lots of times people think, oh, finance, they just care about money, right? But actually, they're benevolent. They're less conformist than the general population. They're less hedonistic than the general population. They're less power-oriented than the general population. They're less security-oriented, which is a measure of risk aversion. So they're less risk-averse than the typical member in the general population. They're more stimulation-oriented. They're more self-directed. They're more stimulation-oriented. They're less tradition-oriented. And even though this is small, they're more universalist. Now, the reason I like showing this data, the general picture, is because I look at this and I say, oh yeah, this is what an academic is, right? So you care, you're stimulation-oriented, you're not traditional, right? You're self-directed, right? I mean, we take risk, right? So this is what we do. But most importantly, I guess for the purpose of this talk, is we're benevolent, and even though this is small, we're universalists. We're more other-regarding than people in the general population. Now you may say, oh, that's a really small difference, but think about the directors. So directors are less other-regarding than the general population. So finance academics are more other-regarding than the general population. And so this, to me, gives me some hope that you know, we need to teach critical thinking to our students, but we also need to produce research that we can teach them. And how do we do that is we have the right values. And so I think the fundamentals are good, but now obviously, given that academia is under attack, you know, our positions are less certain than they were before, but I think if we really want to save the world, we can't give up now. All right, thank you.